All right, great. So we are going to have the question and answer session. So Bet.
Okay, this is extremely fascinating because I grew up in an Orthodox Christian church, and so this is really helpful. But I am now about to take my yoga teacher training test, which is a part of it's on Kundalini yoga. So I kind of feel like I also transversed all these things. Okay, I'm going to tell you guys about a vision I had on my meditation retreat. I had a vision. So I saw an Ayurvedic person, and she told me I need to work on grounding. So most of the days in this Mexico place, it's in the jungle along the ocean, no electricity, no Wi-Fi. I've been working this grounding meditation, and I think on Thursday or Friday, I'm doing this for like 5 days, I felt my whole body as heavy as a ton. And it was like, I almost felt like I couldn't move. And then I had this vision that the world is, we have the Big Bang and then we have the Big Crunch. And that every time we do this Big Bang Crunch cycle, we get more evolved. The whole thing, the plants, the cats, us, the dogs, the snails, all of us, the Martians, whoever lives on, we're all getting more evolved, and we're all doing it by creating our own consciousness and doing our Kundalini or whatever you believe in. And that it's okay if we don't get it done this time. We can do it again in the next big crunch. And I just felt so much peace because I sometimes take like my job too seriously of like trying to help us all get evolved. And it's like I can do whatever I can, and then if we don't make it this time, whatever, we'll just do it next time. So I just wanted to share that. And I hadn't heard about a lot of those people, and I also didn't know other people thought like this. But this is my own vision that I had in the jungle.
Okay, Bet. Woof, what a relief. Okay, I can do this again. Thank God, because time's a ticking and I'm not getting anything done. All right, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to ask about. So, I mean, coming from the integral world, there's this basically the sense of attainment. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of a hierarchy there. Okay, it's coming from yellow, so it's yellow's definition of hierarchy, but it's basically based on attainment. And I'm coming at this question from a Buddhist angle here, so particularly a sort of Tibetan Buddhist angle. But and I think Wilbur has the kind of line going out on forever. There's always some higher attainment. But as you move up into kind of Vajrayana or whatever within Buddhism, the whole question of attainment becomes questioned as just another illusion. And actually what wisdom becomes is non-attainment. It's realizing that it's not about grasping and grabbing. It's actually about letting go, and that the complete enlightenment is achieved at the point of completely letting go and achieving no view. So at the point you let go of all views and all attainment, that's enlightenment. So there's an inherent tension there between the integral view of these stages and the kind of wisdom view, if you like. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Yeah, could I say something about that in response to that? Yeah, I think yeah, very, very good point. I think in my experience that very well captures what you've just said, very well captures one possible difference between yellow and turquoise. I think it's the yellow level is very much about, this is speaking in very, very general terms. The yellow level is very much about attainment and moving to higher levels, looking back and seeing things in terms of these higher and higher levels of development, seeing things in terms of linear time, which is necessary, the necessary background measure for attainment to make any sense. What I've found is as we move into turquoise, we relax that whole sense of linear time. And in that relaxation, the sense of attainment also starts to move away. So I think the Vajrayana, at its pinnacle, the Vajrayana view that you're mentioning there of letting go of views, of teachings, of the sense of attainment, I think is more compatible with the turquoise level than the yellow level. That's one of the key differences I see between those two approaches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Brendan?
We'd also kind of suggest maybe turquoise is the end of the road in that sense, because once you've given up on attainment, where else is there left to go? Do you know what I mean? It's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, yes. I mean, if we do say there are levels higher than turquoise, that's only how it looks to yellow. It's yellow that's looking ahead of yellow and seeing turquoise and higher levels. When we're centered in turquoise, I don't think we'd be talking in terms of levels at all. I think that, you know, levels is very much a yellow paradigm.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. This was fantastic. Probably the best presentation I've seen on this topic. And one, I hope this video is shareable. The presentation, if I don't know if that's going to be generally shareable, but I would love to be able to put that out there and provide it as sort of a really crucial summary primer on this whole issue. That's just a logistical.
It's going to go up on YouTube.
Awesome.
In the near future, let's put it that way.
Great. My question was, in each slide, you mentioned the historical emergences of these different levels. And this is a big topic of interest for me at the moment, especially there's a lot of conversation in various communities around thinking about how these unfolded in historical time and to what degree it's helpful or potentially too simplistic to think about maybe sort of linear sequences when these things seem to potentially unfold in sort of non-linear and highly dynamic and complex ways. So for example, the orange level, you mentioned making sort of a brief emergence in sort of classical antiquity with Socrates and Plato, et cetera, but then sort of kind of disappearing, or not disappearing, but as you said, kind of going underground, and then sort of re-emerging with the Western Enlightenment and Renaissance. Could you say more about how it's maybe best to think about these different levels emerging historically? What's the relationship between sort of individuals in a society that might be operating at these levels versus how helpful it might be to be using this level terminology to refer to entire periods or societies? Yeah, any of that topic would be, I'd love to get your thoughts on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It is very simplistic, and the way I spoke of historical emergence is a hugely simplified generalization. And also what you said, which is that these levels don't always emerge in a very neat linear fashion, I think is also absolutely right. One way that I've found useful to think about it is that there may be in any given period of history, you know, a handful of what we could call exceptional individuals who plug into levels that are significantly higher than what is the norm for the culture or society or world around them. But it could be a very long time before that becomes seen again or seen at all in significant numbers. I think that's what we see with orange, with the ancient Greeks. We had this handful of outstanding individuals who seemed to plug into sort of low orange ways of thinking, but it didn't really emerge in any significant way until the Western Enlightenment, which was what, close to 2,000 years later. In that case, I think one of the factors was that some of the lower levels, like the blue dominance of Catholicism in the West, may have suppressed the emergence of that level, which could have happened maybe much earlier in a much bigger way. So there's all kinds of factors at play here, but one of the ways Ken Wilber suggests to look at it in his book Up from Eden, which I found quite useful, is that there's a difference between what level the highest few key individuals at a given time are plugging into, as opposed to where the majority of that culture is at a given time. So we can see peaking in different ways, peaks in a few individuals, peaks in culture at large. We can also see the stronger re-emergence of some of the lower levels inhibiting clear linear emergence of the higher levels. I think even in the last 20 years, we've seen quite a resurgence of blue with Brexit and Trump and so on. And obviously in much bigger ways, we've seen that in the past. So it is quite a messy picture. And any kind of talk we give about or make about historical emergence has to be in very, very general terms. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, just one last thought on that
Mm.
note is if you have, say, a predominantly orange level in, say, modern Western society, there are certainly ways, it seems to me, that people maybe say at a blue level can kind of pick up the language and the terminology and sort of embrace orange via a blue lens, and that also sort of seems to potentially complicate average level versus, most
Mm.
advanced level, because maybe even in America, it's primarily the average might be blue, but using sort of an orange level symbol set or something like that. Yeah, but thank you very much. It's
Yeah.
very helpful.
Thank you. No, I think you're right. Yes. I mean, I think, again, there are different lines of development, if you like, that in a given individual or a given culture, you can have different lines of development at different levels. So somebody's cognitive line might be orange, but their self line or their interpersonal line or their emotional line or their values line might be blue. And in that situation, they could be using the orange language that they're now sufficiently cognitively developed to use, but to promote blue values, which is where their center of gravity is. So yeah, nobody's just at one level. We're all a mixture of different levels, depending on where these different lines of development are situated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul?
Yes. Nish, first of all, thank you very, very much. This has been incredibly interesting. And I got a ton of notes here that I'm going to have to sift back through later. This question comes up somewhat out of, the way you laid out the three main principles that have to exist if you talk about spirituality, that of, spirit has to exist, self has to exist, a relationship between the two of those has to exist. So there's this triangle of spirit, self, and relationship, and it's kind of that issue that I want to ask a question about. I was raised in a very incredibly blue, probably even somewhat red environment growing up. And so the whole concept about soul, mind, body, emotion, soul, that was drilled into me. But as I matured, in some ways, because the self is, at least at this point, you have to think in terms of the self as having a physical component, and that there's a relationship between that physical component and the emotional and intellectual components. And I think that's where the concept of the self or of the soul came out of. So, but as we saw, in your presentation, once you got to orange, that concept of the soul kind of went away. And particularly if you follow a lot of atheistic podcasts and things like that, you really see that on display of well, I've grown up and I just accept the fact that when I die, everything blinks out of existence. And so I guess what I'm at, what is your take on the whole idea of, and I'll use a term that I learned many, many years ago, this continuity of consciousness, the idea that, obviously I don't believe that the body can, beyond death, the body continues to exist, but the idea of consciousness existing in some form, either in a, if you use Sheldrake's morphogenic field or Jung's collective consciousness or, a holistic universe. What's your thought on, in a sense, that continuation of that relationship between spirit and self, the universe and the self? What what have you learned about that, or what's your opinion on that right now?
Do you mean what's my opinion on the continuity of self-consciousness in some form after
Yes,
after
in
death?
some, and I have no idea what what form that takes.
I'm quite agnostic about the continuity of consciousness. I have to say I've been quite impressed with the evidence for reincarnation. I mean, looking at the phenomenon of past life memories, which I've done a lot of reading in that field, but by doctors who've studied cases of young children remembering past lives and then various details being confirmed and so on. I found that to be a lot more impressive than I thought I would. So I'm very open to the possibility or even likelihood of some kind of continuity of self after death. I'm not committed to that view. I wouldn't say I believe in that with any kind of certainty. I'm inclined in that direction. If there is something that survives, then obviously it's nothing physical, because
Right.
the physical body and the physical brain disintegrate. So I'd have to be open to the possibility of some kind of subtle aspect of ourselves continuing in some form and then remanifesting in another gross form in our thinking at a later date. But that view is fraught with so many issues and so many philosophical problems. I mean, what is manifestation in this regard? What is consciousness in this regard? What is time in this regard? So, I mean, that's a huge subject. But I mean, in summary, I'm strongly inclined in that direction. But I'm not 100% convinced. My own practice tends to be Buddhist, so that's the kind of framework that I've been studying with anyway.
I guess you and I are on the same page on that. Then there's obviously, I don't have any sense of certainty or strong belief like someone in a that's fundamentalist Christian who firmly believes in what they believe in. But I guess I agree with you totally on what that is. I don't know for sure, but I incline in a certain direction. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. I have to say I don't spend too much time thinking about it, because I think we don't know, and we probably can't know with any kind of certainty. My approach has been to concentrate as intensely as I can on my practice now, and then let's see what happens. At the very least, we'll be better prepared for death if we practice serious spiritual practice now. Because if we're letting go of self now, when the time comes to die, it might be a lot easier to let go of self at that point, regardless of what may happen later.
It's interesting you say that. I've recently read a book, Mind After Death, I think it was the title of it, where they talked about the bardos, and that's essentially the message that book contained, is that the more you work on that, the easier the transition is in the bardos.
Yes, that's I think the Tibetan view, yes, and even the motivation to some degree to practice in this life.
Right.
Okay, Josh.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions I'm curious you could comment on. I definitely appreciated your presentation. The framework makes sense to me, and you sort of elaborated on it at the end where you said these words that we used, or that you used, were fit into maybe blue and orange, so that's why it doesn't necessarily cover. But maybe if you can just comment on a few pieces I noticed, which I found interesting. So that orange sees the spirit manifested in the material world. So they certainly would not be using that term spirit as their Bitcoin or whatever. But but that's, that's one piece. And the other piece is, so the conception of self, of course, a lot of the Eastern philosophies don't believe in a conception of self. So it's almost like a negation of the self. And then finally, the idea that things are awry and need to be fixed. I think that holds true pretty much across the board, but I'm wondering if you think that also holds true in terms of elements of Buddhism or Taoism that are like, no, it's already good, you just don't know it. But in a sense, the not knowing, the maybe needing to chip away or shed the layers, that is the paradise lost. So just any thoughts on all that?
Yep, great points. I'll try to cover all three. So the orange view of spirit as the material world. In the most general sense of the term, spirit means that which is the truest, highest, deepest reality, that which is of ultimate concern. A pure orange thinking won't even talk or think in terms of spirit. It will just see the material world as being the empirically measurable world as being the only reality, and therefore the highest reality. Spirit is how we are characterizing it. I mean, orange themselves wouldn't see it as spirit, but I think the material world is just what the ultimate reality is in the purest orange sense of the term. The idea of no self in Buddhism, yeah, I did agonize over this a bit when I was putting together the presentation. I think, again, we have to, I'm using the principle of self in the most general possible term, so that even the realization of no self in a way is covered by that term. So in Buddhism, take Theravada Buddhism, for example, self would be seen as a construction of these different parts of the entity which are constantly in flux, and there's no real permanent essential self underneath all of that. Well, that constructed self in a way then becomes the principle of self in that tradition, and the principle of spirit in that tradition is what the Buddha called the unborn, which is that which we realize when we see through that construction of self and we realize no self. So it's a different way of formulating it, but it's still, in very general terms, we can talk in those terms. And the final point, which is the point of what we could call non-duality, which is in some of the highest Buddhist traditions, highest Hindu traditions, which is actually everything's perfect just as it is, and there's nothing to search for. I think, and I wanted to include this in the presentation, but it would have just gone on for too long. There is a point at which this whole story, from spirit, self, and so on, these 7 principles, they collapse, and we actually see that the story itself was just an illusion. The story itself was just a game that spirit was playing in the world. And that's, in some sense, that final realization that you're talking about, which is that really there was nothing ever wrong in the first place. But typically, we need to go through this story to get to the point of no story. It's like someone climbs a ladder to get onto the roof, and then they look behind them and they realize, well, actually, there is no ladder and there is no roof. So I think the story collapses when you get to that level of non-duality right at the end. But I think that's a relatively rare realization still within the traditions. And certainly in the Abrahamic traditions probably wouldn't have a version of that.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Nish. That was magnificent. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was your personal experience as you shared that and how you evolved. What's funny for me is I feel like I moved into Orange at a very young age. My father died when I was 9, and people would tell me things like God wouldn't give you a challenge that you couldn't deal with or something. And I just quickly rejected that. But it took me a long time to get much past that. I was interested in ethics in college, and where would an ethical structure come from if there is no blue? And it was probably till I was in my mid 40s till I got up into this level of where we are now, which that's just my interesting story there. But I've always felt in spiral dynamics that we use the lower memes, the purple and red memes, a lot more than we like to think. And when you talked about Trump and Brexit, and when in your red egocentric, where you talked about the power gods and the suffering is weakness and loss of power, lack of respect and dishonor. I mean, those are Trump supporters. I mean, they're red, and you sort of wonder. I mean, they probably felt like they had more power, but now they've lost it, and they just worship this Trump guy very irrationally, thinking that they're going to gain his favor. It occurred to me that the popularity of Trump is that he never criticizes his faithful, that they, it's always somebody else's fault. It's the immigrants, it's the liberals, it's the elite, but they love him because they themselves can be as irrational and as powerless as they can be, but he's going to help them. And that's what it's all about. And it seems like recently Boris Johnson's in a little trouble. You can comment on that much more than I can. Trump never seems to be in any trouble. People just love him. But it does seem like Boris was a little more rational, had a little more meat behind his policies, and is having a little trouble. But that's just my thinking. I'll let you comment on the difference maybe between Brexit and Boris and Trump and all of that. But thank you again. That was a magnificent presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, what I'll say, what always puzzled me is how can this actually happen if evolution is this nice, steady progress up the levels? What would happen to bring about this sudden seeming demise in our development, where somebody like Trump comes into power, or something like Brexit happens, which seems to be thinking in very linear terms, seems to be a regression of a kind. My speculation would be that some of the levels like orange and green in some ways have developed in slightly unhealthy ways. They do have some unhealthy or extreme manifestations going on. And when that happens, they can fail to truly integrate the lower levels. Each level is theoretically, at any rate, supposed to transcend and include the lower levels in some way. I don't think that happens fully until yellow. But as the levels develop, if they alienate the lower levels by manifesting an unhealthy version of themselves, those lower levels can actually come back with a vengeance, if you like, because they have failed to be truly seen, truly integrated by the higher levels. Maybe that's what has happened with some of the lower levels of development, red and blue, is they felt they weren't truly seen by the orange and green people in power. And maybe there's some kind of developmental, strange, unfortunate developmental correction going on here as different levels try to balance themselves out with other levels. I mean, that's a speculation. But I wonder evolution can go up as well as down at large. And I wonder if that is in some sense related to unhealthy forms of the higher levels gaining ascendancy. Does that make any kind of sense at all?
Yes, but I'm wondering, like, is a Trump supporter who's appealing to the power, they obviously have some components of blue and orange, so, and maybe some green, but they themselves, like you say, have not integrated a healthy version of orange I mean, of red and blue and orange, and then when life circumstances, life conditions, as we talk about, start to change, they, since they're not particularly healthy, that's what allows them to go back to red, which is also very unhealthy.
Yes.
But
yes. Yeah, I mean, we have this principle of the culture wars. Instead of being any kind of integration taking place between the levels, we're seeing that different subcultures are emerging and they're at war with each other. And it's probably not until yellow that even the possibility in our vision of any kind of integration of these actually comes into force.
so that we can have an unhealthy green and an unhealthy wokeness, we can have an unhealthy orange, we can have an unhealthy blue, and so it's like our whole society is a bunch of unhealthy everything.
In some ways, yes.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if we have to go through this very, I don't know, these extreme of polarities in order to bring at least some of us, or to help us transcend to something higher. It's almost like we have to bring out all the dirt that we are all sort of a part of and playing into with our own sort of obscured and views and our own shadows. We need to see it starkly to help us. At least that's what I'm hoping, that we're not just all regressing, but this is somehow taking us forward, just messy in the process. I wanted to read somebody's comment in the chat area, but David, if you have something to say related to the previous conversation, why don't you go ahead? David?
Hi, sorry, I had to unmute myself there. I'm not sure which comment you're referring to, but the reason I raised my hand is I wanted to add to the conversation when talking about the concept of Trumpism, that as I've been saying, I've become like more and more aware that there's really a lot of downshifted green in the whole Trump phenomena. And when I say that, what I mean, for example, is when I was younger, the culture wars, the right-wing side of the culture war was very much in the blue, you know, censorship, absolutism, you know, sticking to the ideology. And with Trumpism, it seems there has been a shift where like the balance in the culture war has shifted more over to the green side. And the right wing is like conceding that they're now having to fight that culture war on the postmodern turf. They're having to not be as absolutist. They're willing to have some moral relativity where they sacrifice their values by supporting someone like Trump in order to ironically defend their values. Or when they bring up the concept of alternative facts, it's going into this whole the green relativism of, you know, your own reality and like the narcissism of all views are equal relatively. And so I think we have to kind of be aware that there is a lot more postmodernism, a lot more green. And a lot of times what Trumpism is kind of showing is actually a reflection of what the green emergence is looking like from that part of society. And also when kind of like the white identity kind of viewing itself as an oppressed minority and this kind of counter to the counterculture is kind of in a lot of ways the Trump supporters copying what they see in green values. If that makes any sense, if I'm hopefully explaining that clearly enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've highlighted really well here is the weakness of putting people just at one level, or putting a party or a culture just at one level. I think even if one's center of gravity might be red or blue or orange, if we're living in a society where there's a huge amount of green discourse going on, then we will by necessity adopt some of that language and that thinking in order to be able to put our own opposition to it. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like, green values are becoming more and more part of the culture, and to where both the left and the right are kind of using those terminologies and all the irony. Irony is a very postmodern, a very green kind of thing, but you see that the right wing is using that a lot to show contradictions and to make their points.
Okay. So Marjorie had a question and she typed it in the chat, so I'm going to read it for her. I guess this question is for you, Nish. So what is your take on the current debate on system theory as being colonial, as proposed by Nora Bateson and others? And how might this affect our understanding of the evolution of religion?
I think that, yeah, great. Thanks for this really easy question. I think that I think there is ample evidence now over the last 100 years that there is some validity to stage theory. I don't think it's a lot of nonsense. I think there is, ample evidence in developmental psychology now that human beings do evolve through stages. We can debate the exact terminology and the exact specifics of the model, but some kind of stage-specific development does seem to take place. What I think Nora Bateson is highlighting correctly is how these models can be misused. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the models themselves have no validity, because I think stage development is real based on everything I've seen and read and studied and experienced. But it's possible to use the notion of stages in a very unhealthy way, and in a way that can then open it to accusations of being colonial. So I think we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We maintain what we know with a reasonable confidence, which is that people and cultures develop in stages. But we're also very aware of the validity of the green critique of yellow. That's effectively what we're talking about here, I think. The green critique of yellow is that yellow can be misused to rank people and to rank societies. And that can, if politically, for example, if implemented with some kind of unhealthy political agenda, that can lead to valid accusations of what Nora is generalizing as colonialism. Yeah.
Right, in the same way that religion can be weaponized or overly simplified, or any philosophy or basically any theory can be used. So she does have a point from that perspective.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, every stage, I think, has a healthy and an unhealthy version, and yellow and integral is no exception. And I think what Nora might be highlighting here is that an unhealthy version of yellow is possible and has even manifested at times. But I think the solution of that is not to throw yellow in the bin and go back to green, but it's to integrate the valid points that green is making to move us to a healthier version of yellow. So it's the whole transcend and include dynamic there, I think.
Myrene, do you have a comment?
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Nish, an amazing thinker and very balanced perspectives. I'm not at the stage where I can particularize the various memes, but hope to get there. I feel like a little baby in this room. So this is really amazing to me, and I look forward to being more versed in it and contributing more over time. I was looking at it and following along from the stages that you had gone through, Nish, and was relating more to that. And I too have pages of notes. So I didn't have any questions in particular, but I didn't think that it was fair for me not to comment and show my appreciation. So thank you very much. I have to drop off shortly. But I really appreciated this presentation and have really gained deeply from it. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, Maureen. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay, Paul?
I just had a comment on the discussion that kind of swarmed around Trump and Brexit, et cetera. And it does seem to me that the energy that has stirred up and I'll just speak to the U.S. because that's where I live. This red-blue anger and resentment really does come out of both the orange and the green's rejection of red and blue. If you read, I mean, somebody made the comment about Hillary's comment on the deplorables. Well, that kind of sums up what if you would say what the woke Greens' attitude towards red and blue is. They're all just a bunch of deplorables. And if you read one thing that you really if you read Harari's, particularly Homo Deus, he's very clear that orange is going to obliterate. I mean, not just, they don't disrespect. Orange is going to obliterate red and blue. I mean, that's the message that comes out of that book. So it's not surprising that there's the backlash that's going on now. Orange has to find a healthy way of expressing itself, and green has to do the same thing. That's part of the healing and the maturing process, I think.
Yes, I think I'm in general agreement with what you're saying. Yeah, I think there are some, from their point of view, from the red-blue point of view, they do have something to be unhappy about. And I think it's, even though we may not necessarily hold that point of view, if we can somehow go down to that level, that there is a reason why that red-blue reaction has happened. And I think, as you said, it is because perhaps they feel ignored, or, in spiral dynamics language, simply not integrated in any way at all by orange and green. And I think it's probably at yellow. It's only really at the yellow altitude that we have sufficient altitude to be able to see what we're talking about today and how any kind of integration can actually happen.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey,
Thank you.
Nicholas. Nicholas, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm at work, so I'm trying to do multitask a little bit. I really enjoyed the talk. There was a comment about red and why you placed that was a fear of death. Because, a lot of like the Viking cultures, it was more like the fear of the afterlife. They almost like cherish death to a degree. That's how you get to Valhalla if you die a good death. Or even like the red, like suicide bombers who aren't really fearing death, or like more into fearing the afterlife. So I was just kind of wondering why you put that there, or if it was if that's more of a blue ideology as opposed to a red one.
When I mentioned fear of death in red, I was intending that to be one of the triggering factors that bring about the emergence of blue. So the fear of death isn't, as you rightly say, it isn't a mainstay characteristic of red. But for each level, I was trying to identify what are some of the things that happen when we reach near the end of that level that bring about the necessity for a new level to emerge. And I think fear of death starts to emerge at very high red as red starts to wind down. And that is one of the factors that brings about the need for this even bigger perspective, which can help to reduce the fear of death, which are these traditional religious beliefs you have in blue. So I think fear of death is kind of at the transition between red and blue. It's one of the things that can bring about that transition.
Because I always thought that
Mm.
that was
Go
more
on.
of a blue to orange transition, just because then life is actually good. You know, the transition to blue to orange is now life is getting good on material levels, and
Mm.
there's not a total identity that we're going to go to heaven or hell. Like fear of the afterlife was still there, but when you don't believe that there's an afterlife, you're a lot more afraid of death, and that kind of launches you into more orange beliefs. Because even like the emergence of red, it was still used by like the early barbarians to, if you die in battle, you're going to go to heaven. Fight for the Christians, you know, even fight for the Muslims to go. If you die in battle, you're going to be going to heaven. You know, that was kind of how blue manipulated red into doing things, as opposed to when it goes to from blue to orange, you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm kind of afraid of that, actually.
Mm. I think fear of death is one of the when we emerge as a separate ego, when we truly emerge, the individual ego truly emerges as radically separate from the rest of the world and radically separate from people. I think at some point that ego can have an insight into its own mortality, and I think one of the biggest motivations for the emergence of religious belief systems is to deal with the fear of death. That's why religions give us this hope of an afterlife or a belief in an afterlife, because it takes away our fear of death. That's my take on it. Because religions are very good at making people not fear death because they're given this promise of an afterlife. And I think that can be seen as a response to the fear of death that comes when red, right at the end of its time, starts to see the real consequences of its current level of identification with the separate ego. I mean, I actually, in my experience, I've actually found that the transition of blue to orange brings with it the fear of death. The fear of death can come back again in orange because we lose these comforting and consoling mythologies that we had at blue. So people who are at the stage of orange can be motivated to really keep themselves busy with achievements in this life because they're trying not to think about dying, because it's something that hasn't truly been dealt with in any satisfactory form at orange. That's just how I've seen it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think we can somewhat agree to disagree.
Yeah.
And then also, how much do you see like the emergence of cultures after the disembodiment of the religious? You know, so like going back to orange, once orange emerged, it was kind of like when the fantasy reappeared. You know, so that's when they started talking about the gods not as a reality, but as myth. I mean, just fantasy. Even, you know, most people that go to church go to the service, praise Jesus, and they leave, and they talk about their favorite comic book character and their favorite movies. How do you see that? Is that part of Orange too? Is like that form of media, seeing purple as media, purple and red as media, as opposed to an embodiment of living? Or is
Sorry,
it something different altogether?
I'm sorry, I'm not. I didn't quite get the second half of that about purple and red. What were you asking there?
Is that so? Like when you go to orange or a higher mean value, do those lower religious values turn into cultural fantasy play type things, and that's kind of where it belongs? Or is that just trying to integrate that older psyche back into us?
I think orange tends to look at earlier religious beliefs and even earlier magical beliefs, very generally speaking, as superstitions from the past that we no longer need in our modern world. But I think as orange matures and we maybe move into high orange, early green, we can maybe start looking at magic and myth in more constructive ways as maybe metaphors for deeper realities. But I think early orange would just react to these earlier formulations as superstitions. And I think as orange matures, then we can maybe integrate these in a different way, that we can see notions like God and the soul and heaven and hell as metaphors for what orange sees as orange realities.
And so by like saying they're seeing more as metaphors, it's like the same thing as saying you see them in literature, and you know, like Shakespeare had all the gods. You know, they're not reality, but these are metaphors and examples and models
exactly.
for orange to live by.
Yeah, that can definitely happen. I think high orange and even into green, I think that can definitely happen. Once we grow out of, I think in early orange, we go through a stage, at least I went through a stage, and I've seen it in many others, of just writing off religion and magic as just a load of nonsense. That we're well out of. Human beings have matured now. But I think as we mature, we can go back and see metaphorical value in these. As you say, we can use them in literature and music and so on, without literally believing in them, like we might have done at the earlier levels.
Oh, and that's kind of why you put like Mahayana Buddhism above Theravada, because you know Theravada is very atheistic and Mahayana is more of like the mythical stories to lead to a quicker, almost a better, more holistic way of enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point, which I hadn't actually thought of. Yeah, that is actually another way of contrasting Mahayana with Theravada. And we see that in Christianity. There's more liberal forms of Christianity now that may not literally believe in virgin births and resurrections and so on, but see them as useful literary forms for transmitting deeper truths that orange and green can accept metaphorically through these mythological and magical forms. And that's another way, I think, if someone said, well, if someone's stage was orange or green, but they still wanted to be religious, they still enjoyed that context of their belief system. Take Christianity as an example, they can still engage in that without the literal belief, but see these stories as just as literary forms, as literature, as metaphors that point to deeper truths that orange and green can actually get on board with. And there's entire movements in Christian theology that do that. There are theologians that have written volumes on how we can do that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's almost more now Christianity is the same. Going to a church is like going to a Star Wars or an anime convention.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there are people, there are people who relate to it that way. I know people who practice religion quite seriously. Outwardly, they do all the things traditional religious people do, but for them, it's an art form. They see it as an art form. It's like, you know, playing music or reading poetry or going to a museum. It's just a way of engaging with truth, beauty, and goodness without taking on board the literal fundamentalist views that you can see at the earlier levels.
Well, thank you, Nish, for your fantastic presentation. We all really enjoyed it, and hope to see you at the next Spiral Dynamics integral presentation. Bye.
Thank you.